Here is a selection of events that a subscriber, who I shall refer to as Norseman, has sent me. Norseman lives in the woods around the area of Thorny Hill in the New Forest, and he lives in the woods. He lives off grid, and he sent me a selection of stories, things that have happened to him over the past few years whilst living in the New Forest. He can't remember the dates exactly, but I'm going to read some of the experiences that he's had. He writes, "Firstly, I began as a bushcraft prepping survival type and was very sceptical about anything supernatural or paranormal. I grew up in the woods and never had a reason to be worried or cautious. I spent many nights alone in the woods and hiking through the New Forest after dark and never had anything happen to me or even suggest I should think otherwise. One night," he writes, "me and a friend were up for a weekend of hammocks and bushcraft in the forest. We parked at the Underwood barbecue site, geared up and started our trek. After an hour of walking off the track, we were convinced that we were all alone, far from the public. It had been a long time since we had seen anyone, and there was only one car in the car park when we had arrived. We set up camp, and it was a standard nighttime routine. Hammocks up, small stove lit, kettle on. The sun had set a long time ago and the night was still. It was extremely quiet. It was evident there that no one was around for miles, but yet both of us felt as if we were being watched. The night got darker and we retreated to our hammocks suspended above the trees. It was a sense of security much needed that night, and it wasn't long before I drifted to sleep. I was woken up by my friend, who said he had heard something around the backpacks hanging from the branches below us. I told him, and even convinced myself, it was a deer that had been down there, but he was adamant it wasn't. At the point of arguing about it, we were interrupted by a loud banging sound. The banging sound was accompanied by the occasional crack, and it was obvious someone or something was banging a large log against a tree not so far away in the distance. As bushcrafters, we often had axes and knives on us, and so, brave and confident, went to find out what the noise was. We must have only got a few feet from the camp when a second log started to be hit against a tree in a second direction, almost in response to the first banging. We both stopped and waited, unsure of what to do. It was around 3 a.m, and under the pines you couldn't see a thing. Our headlamps could barely make out the shadows from the trees. We edged backwards towards the camp, where we found one of the bags was no longer on the tree, but it had been opened and left behind some ferns nearby. We quickly packed up, hiked back to the car park, and made our way home. Once regaining phone signal, I googled the curious event and discovered that it could have been Bigfoot activity, and to this day I believe it was. It didn't put us off, however, and we continued to use the Underwood for our weekend bushcraft camps for many years. It was long after the hammock experience, and we were walking our usual track from the barbecue site to a bridge. It was a long track, straight, and in the day or night the bridge can clearly be seen. This night our vision was impaired by the rain blowing in our faces, but regardless we continued to the bridge, our headlamps the only light we had, which I usually set to red. We got to the bridge and spent a while looking at the river flowing under it. It was rising rather fast, and it amused us to watch. As our heads moved around, darting about as we spoke, and turned to look around, the light beams from the headlamps were constantly dashing around all over the place, when in the corner of my eye, via my friend's lamplight, I saw something move in the branches of the tree hanging over the river. However, my friend didn't see what I saw, and moved the light out of the way whilst moving his head, unaware of what I'd seen. I spun my head round and put my own headlamp on the spot I'd seen it. However, nothing was there, and all of a sudden my friend shouted, "Did you see that? I just saw something." We decided to draw what we had both seen. I can only describe it as a Barbie with butterfly wings, swinging with agility, flitting off into the rain. To this day I am convinced it was a sprite or fairy type creature, maybe a nymph, as they live near water. We continued our bushcraft camps for long after this, and eventually found a preferred spot near to the Burbush car park, which is on the other side of Burley. We had found a small secluded open spot amongst the ferns and trees, and over time we built a small round house from heather and sticks. And it was almost a semi-permanent camp. We continued to use this camp for an entire summer. Most weekends we'd be out there in the summer sun and enjoying our free time. One weekend it was raining so hard and the wind was so strong, we got halfway to the little hut and discussed not proceeding, but curiosity of how our build would stand in this weather got the better of us, and we pushed on. Eventually we got to the hut, and to our dismay it was crumbling and falling apart, just as we had expected. There were a few things we had left there, so we gathered them up and stood inside, waiting for some respite in the weather. It had only been a few minutes of us stood there in silence, when a low-pitched grumble, mistaken at first for thunder, caught our attention. We listened and waited for lightning, but nothing. Instead, there it was again, another grumble, but it was more like a growl this time. I looked at my friend and did not have to say a thing. His face said it all. He heard it too, and there it was again. It was getting closer. We decided to bolt for the car. It was a fair distance, but we didn't have our usual gear, our backpacks, and we're both quite fit, so we began to run, against the wind and the rain, splashing through the mud and puddles. I could hear my feet splashing and squelching. I could hear my friend's feet splashing and squelching, but I could also hear a third set of feet splashing and squelching, accompanied by deep breathing. I don't think I have ever run so fast in my life. There was something chasing us. As we saw the car in the car park from across the grass, my friend unlocked it with the key button, and we practically jumped into the car. Headlights on full beam, we sat there and waited to see what was behind us, to see if it caught us up and would run into the light. But it didn't. Instead, there was nothing. We sat for a while longer and still no sign. I rolled down the window, just a little to listen. All of a sudden there it was, a growl coming from right next to the car in the bushes. The engine was already running, and my friend didn't stick around. He drove out of that car park as fast as he could, but he swears that as he looked into the rear view mirror, he saw some kind of figure stood there in the red lights at the back of the car, watching us leave. Almost a year after this, wanting to show a couple of new friends the area, me and the same friend as before returned to Burbush. The four of us proceeded to walk down the old railway towards the tea room at the end. Between the tea room and the car park is a good long stretch of old railway, about 2/3 of the way up. There's an old brick bridge, or at least what remains of it. It wasn't far from there, where we were, walking towards the bridge. It was sunset, and the lighting was that awkward grey where everything is impossible to see, yet light enough to warrant a torch useless. We walked together in the dull light, talking and chatting, when all of a sudden something ahead of us grabbed our attention. One by one we all saw it, and what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw, was a deer drinking from a puddle. It faced us, looked up, spun around, and began bounding away just as a deer would. It bounded 3 times, and then on the 3rd bound it didn't come back to ground, but instead it took flight. The lighting was tricky and the silhouettes kept inflicting each other, but what we saw was a deer run away from us, take 3 jumps, and then spread eagle wings and soar off into the darkness. Gobsmacked and amazed, we Googled it, and what we found is that such a creature is said to exist. It's called a periton. It's half deer and half eagle. By this time, you can imagine I'm no longer sceptical about these things. My final and most recent encounter was during a group camp, when a group of us were camping out in the New Forest between 2017 and 2018. We were up by Magpie's Hill, between Holmesley and Thorny Hill. We had a circle of tents, and the number of us was quite large, so no one had any reason to be scared or feel at any unease. However, it soon became apparent that some of the camp members were feeling uncomfortable. Some reported feelings of being watched, whilst others had the feeling of being watched when going off into the woods for a pee. Others had sat on the outskirts of the camp and watched as what they could only describe as someone or something moving in the tree line. This was a reoccurring event for the first couple of nights, but it wasn't until maybe the 3rd we started to hear the grumbling and growls, those same growls and grumbles from the burbush all that time ago. The same thing that chased me and my friend out was now watching the camp, the same growling and grumbling, the same intrusive manner. We all backed up into a small huddle, watching and waiting. It was definitely in front of us, you could just sense it, but this time there was no chasing or a hunt. Maybe there was too many of us. Maybe it was because we had a fire, but it stayed in the tree line, growling and grumbling. To this day, some of those people will never camp in those woods again. As for me, I have since taken permanent residency in my own plot of woodland near Holmesley. Me and my partner started off in a bell tent, which had an old school rope door that needed tying up instead of the newer, easier zip. For this reason, we didn't bother shutting it all the time. We'd leave a small gap open under the door. One night, my partner was led there as I slept. It was raining and she was listening to the sound of it on the tent. As she lay there, she heard footsteps, but quickly brushed it off. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. She was led with her back to the open door, the gap not that big, but big enough for something to peer through. As she led there, her back became colder and colder, as if something were focusing right on that spot on her back. It felt like owl eyes, glaring at her. She could take no more and spun around to look, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of footsteps running away and a mischievous little laugh. He goes on to say that he believes woodland folk are all around us, and with patience and understanding, they will make themselves known. Thank you, Norseman, for sending in these accounts. They're really interesting. I have tried to email you back to say thank you.